Hello, welcome back to reading the CTMU. We're reading the Metaformal System, Completing the Theory of Language by Chris Langan. We are on the section Level 1, Natural Languages. I had a thought this morning that I just want to start these videos as well with a little prayer inspired by my grandfather, something he would say before speaking. Let the meditations of my heart and the words of my mouth be pleasing to you, O Lord, my God. I think I reversed the order there, but the meaning is the same. Alright, in that spirit, let us read. Level 1, Natural Languages. A natural language is conventionally understood as the system and method of spoken or written expression and communication among human beings to whose various communities, nations, and cultures it is particular. Natural languages evolve naturally in real-world communities of language users, often in coupling with their cultures and conventions. Natural languages consist of the structured and conventional use of words, i.e., meaningful elements of speech or writing that, where not used alone, are organized to form sentences. A sentence is a complete sequence of words, typically containing a subject and a predicate, which assigns some attribute, often involving an action, to the subject, thus constituting an attributive statement. A sentence includes a main clause, which can stand alone, but may have one or more subordinate clauses attached, and can take the form of a question, command, or exclamation, without losing attributive functionality. A given natural language L equals sigma, gamma, and S of sigma can be specified in terms of 1, a finite alphabet sigma, which contains a collection or a set of symbols there, demarcated by S1, S2, and so on to S of n, of uninterpreted terminal symbols, S of I, or SI, that can be linearly combined to form written words and expressions, and are often associated with sounds that can be spoken in the same order, along with any transitory non-terminal symbols. 2. A grammar or set of structural and transformational rules, gamma, which determine which strings or sequences of alphabetic symbols and words are well-formed, i.e., which strings are potentially meaningful expressions of the language. And 3. The set S of sigma of strings determined by gamma. Whereas expressions contain only... Sorry about that, I was getting uncomfortable. Whereas expressions contain only terminal symbols of sigma, gamma may use any non-terminal symbols in sigma as means to its end, inserting and then replacing them with other symbols in order to produce or derive terminal expressions as the final output of derivation trees orthogonal to the expressions themselves in the ordering of their derivational steps. In this case, the alphabet sigma may be divided into two sets n and t containing non-terminal and terminal symbols respectively. Sigma equals n and t, the non-terminals and the terminals. There are two possible ways to construct a string or expression of L. One can write the expression as a linear sequence of terminal symbols and words by using a set of orthographic rules according to which one symbol or word follows another by concatenation or composition. Alternatively, One can rely on rules of production or generation consisting of syntactic forms and rules of substitution. Production works orthogonally to strings themselves, deriving a string by replacing non-terminal symbols with cumulative refinements along its entire length. Generative grammar begins with the universal start symbol of L, a compact way of representing L as a complete expressive potential, and progressively replaces non-terminal symbols with other non-terminal symbols, and finally with the terminal symbols of the final expression. The grammar of a natural language can be complex and unpredictable, and it is typically discovered through intensive empirical investigation until it is formalized by exhaustively enumerating its rules. The language generated by the grammar cannot be formalized, and the formal definition L equals sigma, gamma, and S of sigma remains useless for reconstructing the language. The formalization criteria described and illustrated above are due to Zelig-Harris, who first described generative grammar as currently understood in 1951, and his student Noam Chomsky, who subsequently named and explicated the concept. That concept would be generative grammar, and I suppose the Chomsky hierarchy, which we'll do some videos on at some point, I'm sure. Natural language is fundamentally conceptual. Its words represent concepts or mental abstractions. The words and signs attached to the concepts are more or less arbitrary. They can vary as long as the concepts themselves retain their integrity. However, there is some amount of controversy regarding the relationship between language structure and cognition. Theories of this relationship range from universalism, cognition determines language, through mutual independence, all the way to strong linguistic determinism, language determines cognition, with intermediate degrees of dependency considered. Note that while this account of natural language refers to the representation of concepts, nowhere does it refer to the objective content, meaning, or interpretation of its expressions. Yet even though one of the primary functions of language is to represent objective facts about the real world, facts which naturally reflect its structure, the natural language concept is defined in complete abstraction from the external universe, which is commonly treated as though it were completely independent of language and cognition. This putative mutual independence of language and universe, the way L equals sigma, gamma, and S of sigma omits the symbol U for universe, thus isolating L from its domain of discourse, amounts to a pernicious form of dualism which abstractly, artificially, and wrongly separates the elements of an inseparable pair. In short, the capacity of language to accurately represent the external universe is far too reliable and extensive for this unequivocal kind of dualism to hold. It is not that we are always successful in predicting factual observations from language alone. Rather, it is the very possibility of bringing language into conformance with reality, and vice versa, that dualism cannot explain. If dualism were justified, and language and reality were truly separate and independent, then there would be no basis for bringing them together, and neither science nor any form of human experience would be possible. The above definition, L equals sigma, gamma, and S of sigma, is therefore misleading in the way that its parentheses, like impermeable walls, isolate human cognitive language from the universe it so effectively but improbably represents. Some readers will recognize that this is simply a formal generalization of the oft-cited unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and the natural sciences to non-mathematical languages and reality at large. It is also a statement to the effect that any language which truly supports the identification of its universe must everywhere couple to that universe through classical two-valued logic, which provides the true, false, or 1-0 distinction, in terms of which the universe, you, and its contents may be distinguished. This coupling is an untapped well that goes very deep indeed. Indeed, all the way to the depths of the CTMU and the ultimate identity of the GOD, Global Operator Descriptor. Alright, for those of you who are sharp-eyed, you might notice that my hair is a little bit longer now, and that's because it's been about a week and a half, couple weeks since I read through the section. Get back to the section. That's because I've been a little bit busy, and also because we're getting into a part of the paper that is involved enough that I wanted to stop and take some notes to really do it better justice. It brings to my mind how my colleague Bernard over at the Self-Duality channel, formerly called Mathematical Metaphysics, said in a recent video how, it's always impressed me how he can just sit and talk off the cuff and go into things in such depth and breadth and do it for such a long time. And talked in a recent video how he's basically relying, when he does that without a script or anything, he's relying on like his metacausal or telic recursive programming that is just bringing the proper thoughts in the proper order for him to communicate, and that when you take notes, you are giving yourself more sort of mechanized programming or whatever, just structure or structured programming to, structure your cognition and guide you through what you're communicating. And I greatly admire and aspire toward that level of just being able to talk off the cuff. But I definitely wanted to have some notes to bring to y'all. Okay, so without further ado, we are at level 1, natural languages. Yes, and Chris goes into quite a lot here, and I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my notes. So natural languages consist of the structured and conventional use of words, i.e. meaningful elements of speech or writing, that, where not used alone, are organized to form sentences. A sentence is a complete sequence of words, typically containing a subject and a predicate which assigns some attribute, often involving an action, to the subject, thus constituting an attributive statement. A sentence includes a main clause which can stand alone, but may have one or more subordinate clauses attached and can take the form of a question, command, or exclamation without losing attributive functionality. So one of the things that I'm really interested here is that Chris goes into the way that formal languages are really just, they're formalizations of natural language, basically, and so that, and formal languages of mathematical structure, they're a part of mathematical logic and mathematics in general, and therefore concepts in natural languages and the study of natural languages should be able to be mapped into mathematical concepts, and I'm really interested in that. So in one of my notes here, I say a subject in natural language, for example, is similar to a constant or variable in a formal language or system. So a constant would be akin to a specific proper or improper subject, such as Ethan or the man, and a variable would be akin to a pronoun, such as he or it. Predicates in predicate logic are functions that return a truth value of true or false based on the input arguments or objects they receive. This is akin to the natural language predicate that assigns a property or action to the subject that can be true or false. So the subject in this case is the object that the predicate is assigned, or equivalently, the predicate is assigned to the object. Here the object is the subject. It's a little bit confusing, I guess, but it works. And that statement that's made about the subject can either be true or false. So I also had a video about, intrinsic geometry, and it got me thinking about how it relates to what he says here about main clauses and subordinate clauses, or equivalently, independent clauses and dependent clauses. Intrinsic geometry deals with properties and relationships that depend solely on the figure, independent of the space around the figure, and this mirrors how main clauses or independent clauses operate, as they are self-sufficient, containing all necessary components, such as a subject and a verb, to stand alone and convey a complete thought without needing anything external to complete the thought. And extrinsic geometry, would be like a dependent clause, where, it relies on the existence of an independent clause to complete its meaning. Anyway, moving on. A given natural language, L, though sigma, gamma, and S of sigma, can be specified in terms of, 1, a finite alphabet, sigma, equals a set of symbols, of uninterpreted terminal symbols, SI, that can be linearly combined to form written words and expressions, and are often associated with sounds that can be spoken in the same order, along with any transitory non-terminal symbols. So this is a really deep topic here. The distinction between terminal and non-terminal is brought up, and the definition of a language in general is brought up, and this is going to be a definition used for formal languages as well. So, but in the case of English, the signature would include the normal alphabet A through Z we are all familiar with, plus any punctuation and other auxiliary symbols, plus the non-terminal symbols that are used in the derivation, such as this picture that I've included here. Non-terminal symbols stand for the different non-terminal categories such as sentence, noun phrase, subject, predicate, prepositional phrase, direct object, indirect object, etc. These are all categories of structure that are implicit in the terminal string and give it the way that the sentence is parsed into a meaningful construct, and that parsing is illustrated here by this tree, where these blue boxes are the non-terminal symbols associated with this terminal sentence or string, and the terminal sentence or string are these light beigeish colored boxes. And note how the direction of the terminal string from left to right, or right to left in some languages, is orthogonal to the up and down overall direction of the direction of derivation of the sentence. So moving down, so you have the top non-terminal symbol, which is the start symbol for the derivation, and then it's broken down sequentially into these layers of more and more specific non-terminal categories until it finally terminates at the terminal words themselves, which compose the sentence. So it's interesting how terminal words are all sort of on the same level. Well, they're all at the terminal level, and they're all, so they're kind of a part of an unordered set with respect to level. they're unordered with respect to level. They're all on the same level. You can group them syntactically confined to what is a well-formed string, but that's different than the non-terminal symbols, which are stratified with respect to level. And so non-terminal symbols compose a partially ordered set of these different layers. So for example, the sentence non-terminal symbol is on a much higher level, is on a, than the ones at the bottom where you have the direct object, a noun phrase. So non-terminal symbols are ordered, and non-terminal symbols are partially ordered, and terminal symbols are unordered in that sense. Although terminal symbols are ordered in the sense that they're written from left to right in order. Okay, a grammar or set of structural and transformational rules, gamma, which determine which strings or sequences of alphabetic symbols and words are well formed, i.e., which strings are potentially meaningful expressions of the language. The grammar of English would include all structural rules necessary to determine what combinations of terminal or non-terminal symbols create a well-formed or potentially meaningful expression of English. Structural rules would include how terminal elements can be combined or concatenated to develop terminal expressions, and how the sentence can be broken into non-terminal symbols or categories. The grammar would also include transformational rules, which include transforming one terminal expression into another while preserving the meaning. So an example of this would be passivization, where a sentence like Bob proposed to Sally is converted to Sally was proposed to by Bob. So transformational rules for non-terminal expressions would include a meaning-preserving alteration of the order or composition of the non-terminal symbols in a non-terminal quote expression. Yeah, so a grammar includes both structural rules and transformational rules. There's this distinction. One of my commenters, a good friend of mine, gave me a useful way of remembering the difference between how grammar and syntax are related differently to each other in natural language, in the study of natural languages, and the study of formal languages. In the study of natural languages, like for example, the tool that he gave was that you go to grammar school and you learn natural language. You go to English class there, and so it's called grammar school. And that's an easy way to remember that grammar is king in the study of natural languages, in the sense that it is the overall, grammar refers to the overall structure. It refers to not only the rules for combining words, but also the study of the structure of words themselves and the sounds, when you say the words, every part, the morphemes and all the different ways of breaking down components of language and studying them are all encompassed by the study of grammar in natural languages. And so that's why I'm referring to grammar here to refer to everything, whereas syntax in natural language is just strictly the study of the structure of sentences, how words are grouped together, whereas in formal language theory, the grammar is a subset of the syntax, where the syntax is the overall structure of the formal language, and the grammar is just the way of deriving the strings, if I'm remembering that correctly. So the way of moving down these levels of this tree right here, basically, except it's a formal language. So it's a little bit confusing, the relationship between grammar and syntax, but basically one or the other is a subset of the other. So the one is more specific than the other. It just depends on if you're talking about formal or natural languages. really, ultimately, it's not very important compared to remembering that language in general has a structure that completely describes what constitutes a well-formed expression of that language. So, yes, in 3, you have the set S sigma of strings determined by the grammar, denoted by gamma. Whereas expressions contain only terminal symbols of sigma, gamma may use any non-terminal symbols in sigma as means to its ends, inserting and then replacing them with other symbols in order to produce or derive terminal expressions as the final output of derivation trees orthogonal to the expressions themselves in the ordering of their derivational steps. In this case, the alphabet sigma may be divided into the 2 sets n and t containing non-terminal and terminal symbols respectively. And that's this expression, this section here is very well illustrated by this tree that I've included here. The downward derivation is these arrows going down. You know, each subsequent level is a step in the derivation until you get to the terminal string. And the terminal string is orthogonal to the up and down direction of derivation. And you can see the separation of the signature into non-terminal and terminal with the different colors used here. That like I said before, the green is non-terminal and the beige is the terminal. Yes, and it's also important to note that you can refer to the set of all well-formed strings without having to exhaustively enumerate the set itself, which would be impossible if a grammar could determine an infinite number of well-formed strings. So even languages which, like English, that contain an infinite number of possible terminal expressions, think of the library of, what is that concept? A library containing infinite books. The library of the library of Babel is a kind of a thought experiment where you have a library that contains a book containing every single possible expression, basically, whether well formed or not, every single combination of the terminal members of the alphabet, and the only limitation on the size of the library is a limitation on the size of the terminal strings that you are to include. So if there's no limit on the size of the terminal string that you're willing to consider, the library of Babel could be infinite and would contain any potential work of literature possible, along with vast number of more books of utter nonsense. So it's kind of a cool thought experiment. But yeah, that's kind of a cool way of thinking about this set of all well-formed strings of a language, I guess. Except this set has to be well-formed. The Library of Babel includes all of the nonsense books that just contain random combinations of the terminal expression. So it's not quite the same, but it's still potentially infinite if you're able to if you are willing to consider strings of infinite length. All right. So there are 2 possible ways to construct a string or expression of L. One can write the expression as a linear sequence of terminal symbols and words by using a set of orthographic rules according to which one symbol or word follows another by concatenation or composition. Alternatively, one can rely on rules of production or generation consisting of syntactic forms and rules of substitution. Production works orthogonally to strings themselves. deriving a string by replacing non-terminal symbols with cumulative refinements along its entire length. Generative grammar begins with the universal start symbol of L, a compact way of representing L as a complete expressive potential, and progressively replaces non-terminal symbols with other non-terminal symbols, and finally with the terminal symbols of the final expression. So these two possible ways to construct a string are again represented by this tree here. You can either generate the expression by moving from the top sentence non-terminal symbol here and refining it through grammatical derivation to the terminal string, or you can simply write the terminal sentence left to right using the terminal words themselves. And that's so when you just put a symbol next to another symbol, that's called concatenation. And composition is when you would compose a word using other words. I'm trying to think of an example of that for natural languages. Well, let me see if I can think of what composition would be. Now, concatenation is when when you're writing the words left to right, one after the other. I guess composition is when you're like replacing a word with like an something more specific perhaps, or less specific of what that word or group of words represents by another word or group of words. So that might be something that's happening as you're writing from left to right, just from sentence to sentence, kind of explaining the same thing, but composing the way that you explained it before with other ways of explaining it. I don't know. If y'all have any thoughts regarding that, I'd be interested to hear. Yes, thoughts of how, when terminally writing a string orthographically, you can use rules of composition as well as concatenation. Alternatively, moving back to what Chris is saying, alternatively, one can rely on rules of production or generation consisting of syntactic forms and rules of substitution. So this is the intuitive way of thinking about composition, where you're composing the non-terminals with more and more specific non-terminals that are within them, so to speak. Production works, yes, orthogonally to strings themselves, deriving a string by replacing non-terminal symbols with cumulative refinements. Yeah, I already read that. Alright, so it is important to note that to decide how to begin replacing the yes, this is a very interesting point here to write about. I'm going to dwell on this some. So when you begin to derive a sentence, you have the start symbol, but then you have an infinite number of ways that you could break down that start symbol or factorize it into non-terminal categories, depending on what type of terminal string you want to end up with. And so the process of derivation necessarily involves some decision regarding what the lower levels of the derivation are going to look like ahead of time. And the more specific with those choices you are, the closer down to the terminal level you decide ahead of time what you want to derive, the more efficient the computation, so to speak, of the derivation of the terminal string is going to be, because it's going to involve it's going to involve less ambiguity with how to proceed down the levels of specificity. So ultimately, if you know in advance what the terminal string is going to be, then you can know what the most direct derivational path from the start symbol to the terminal string is. And this is similar to how Chris talks about telic recursion sometimes. For example, he says that in telic recursion, you basically take your current state, well, you have your current state, and then you define some goal that you want to achieve, and then you work backwards from that goal and define a path from your current state to that goal. That is the most efficient way to get there. And then you subsequently, go through planned state transitions until you achieve that goal and bring it to the terminal level. And this is also reminiscent to, like in physics, you have this view of physical transformations, or mechanics in general, which is called the Lagrangian view or Lagrangian mechanics. And the hallmark of that is that you specify a start point and an end point of the transformation before you do anything else, and that way you're able to derive the path of least resistance, or the most efficient path between the start and the end point. And if I'm being overly simplistic, if anybody has more expertise on that or wants to correct anything I'm saying, go ahead, but this is just where my understanding is at. And so all of that is reminiscent to how you, when you are about to do a grammatical derivation, you have the start symbol, and you need some way to direct your path down the derivation to the terminal expression in order to proceed. And the more specific you set your goal, so to speak, or what you want to derive, the more efficient getting there is going to be. And that's like general wisdom about life, I suppose. If you know where you're going, and don't have a plan, and this is Lord knows I could work on this, but just having a goal, having specific goals, and structuring a path, an efficient path toward those goals, will keep you from just kind of wandering and meandering in life and going down dead ends and such things as that. So it's a really cool general idea here that I'm going into. I'll read through my notes here in case I'm missing anything. Though it is important to note that to decide how to begin replacing the non-terminal start symbol S with more specific non-terminals, you must have not only the grammar of the language, but also some idea about the terminal string that you will produce. This is because the grammar offers many possible ways to refine the sentence at each step, with the number of possibilities increasing drastically at each derivation step. Right, because you're getting more specific. You're getting more and more non-terminal symbols each time. So you have kind of a combinatorial explosion happening. Even if you don't start with the terminal expression in mind, you must at least decide what syntactic form it will take to proceed with an appropriate derivation from the start symbol. The less specific or less terminal an idea you have about what you want to derive, the more ambiguity about how to proceed to a terminal string there will be. And hence, the more computationally inefficient it will be to decide and arrive at a terminal string. So this is similar to the idea in Lagrangian mechanics, which says that you need a starting and ending point for a physical transformation to compute the most efficient path taken by the transformation, where the starting point is like the start symbol, and the ending point is like the terminal expression, and the most energy efficient path is the most computationally efficient derivation. This three-way relationship between the start symbol, terminal string, and derivation reflects the structure of an identity, which is an attribute value or intension-extension coupling. The start symbol is the intension or attribute, the extension or value is the terminal string, and the entire derivation tree encompassing both is the overall identity or the coupling. Chris has described, so that's a point that I didn't go into before. This reflects the structure of an identity in general, and Chris writes about how all of reality is composed of identities. So you all have everywhere you have these intension-extension couplings, or these couplings of basically of generality and specificity, or attribute and value, and they all can be modeled on the relationship that is embodied by a derivation tree. And this is relevant to something Chris talks a lot about, which is syndiphonesis and syndiphionic relationships, of which everything is a part on different levels. And Chris has described telic recursion as when you specify a goal and then define a path from your current state to that goal. In this case, your intention, or your internal mental image of the goal that you have in mind, is the intention. You note the similarity between the word intention with an S and intention with a T. There's a reason why they're so similar, I think, ultimately. With the, so your internal mental image of the goal you have in mind is the intention attribute or start symbol of the eventual terminal string corresponding to the actualization of that goal through the planned concatenation of subsequent states, eventually arriving at the goal as a terminal state. So it gets a little, thinking about it, the analogy gets a little complex here, because I was thinking of the terminal state, the achievement of the goal as a terminal state itself as being the terminal string, but also the events going from one to the other are also terminal states, and in some sense compose a terminal string or world line of yourself. But in another sense, they're also related to the generation of the to the levels of the generative grammar as you move through time, and that sort of goes into a way that time and that time or terminal concatenation and the vertical generative grammar, or what Chris calls the meta time, can be sort of overlaid, and that is ultimately what I think was leading to this nuance I was getting in here in my thinking. And the way that I've been thinking about that overlay is that if you look back up at this parse tree and you imagine that the words, I drive a car to my college, you notice how most of them are on different levels of the parse tree. Well, I think this is kind of similar to how subsequent states, although they are terminal states and compose terminal strings, are also on different layers of they're literally layered. Chris gets into this with conspansion, but the states are inside of their previous states. So this insideness reflects the generative reflects the generative grammar aspect of moving up and down the grammar parse tree, but you're also on the terminal level concatenating states as terminal strings of that generative grammar. And so that overlay, I think, is kind of similar to how the terminal string here is written kind of diagonally, because the words are on different levels to each other. You know, like I would be like a past state that's on a higher level in some sense because it happened in the past, but it's still a terminal state in that it is a terminal word. So I don't fully understand that. That's kind of a new way that I've been thinking about it recently, but I think it might help, you know, if you're sensitive to that nuance, I think it might help to it might help to think about it in those terms. It might be a little bit of a clue as to what's going on. Although I admit to not fully understanding the overlay of time and meta time. Alright, moving on. The grammar of a natural language can be complex and unpredictable, and is typically discovered through intensive empirical investigation until it is formalized by exhaustively enumerating its rules, the language generated by the grammar. Until it is formalized by exhaustively enumerating its rules. The language generated by the grammar cannot be formalized, and the formal definition L equals the alphabet grammar and strings determined by the alphabet and grammar remains useless for reconstructing the language. I don't think I read this sentence. Let me just start over. The grammar of a natural language can be complex and unpredictable, and is typically discovered through intensive empirical investigation. Until it is formalized by exhaustively enumerating its rules, the language generated by the grammar cannot be formalized, and the formal definition L equals the alphabet grammar and strings determined by the alphabet and grammar remains useless for reconstructing the language. The formalization criteria described and illustrated above are due to Zelig-Harris, who first described generative grammar as currently understood in 1951, and his student Noam Chomsky, who subsequently named and explicated the concept. So, yeah, with this general definition of language here, it doesn't give you anything to go off of in actually describing or reconstructing an actual natural language. It's just it's a generalization that applies to natural languages and formal languages. And so the actual specific grammar or alphabet, you know, of any natural language has to be studied through intensive empirical investigation. Yeah. That makes sense. A natural language is fundamentally conceptual. Its words represent concepts or mental abstractions. The words and signs attached to the concepts are more or less arbitrary. They can vary as long as the concepts themselves retain their integrity. However, there is some amount of controversy regarding the relationship between language structure and cognition. Theories of this relationship range from universalism, cognition determines language, through mutual independence, all the way to strong linguistic determinism. Language determines cognition, with intermediate degrees of dependency considered. So I guess universalism says that language or that cognition determines language through mutual independence, and that cognition like precedes language or something, and therefore any language formulated within it is merely supervening on cognition and not affecting cognition or limiting it in any way through its structure. It's basically just inheriting the structure of the cognition. Whereas linguistic determinism says that the structure of the language that is being spoken determines the structure of the cognition of the language user. And so what is relevant here is structure. The structure of a language determining the structure of cognition, or vice versa. Above, he says that the actual words or signs used are arbitrary. You could, as long as the concepts themselves, which they represent, and the structure of the language remains the same, these could vary and it wouldn't affect any of this. Alright, so what does the CTMU say about the relationship between mind and language? Well, it contains both the principle of linguistic reducibility and the mind equals reality principle. So the principle of linguistic reducibility says that reality has the syntax or structure of a kind of language. That everything can be regarded or reduced to language. And mind equals reality says that reality has that of a kind of mind, or the structure of a mind. And so mind and reality in the CTMU are coupled. Language requires processing on the part of something at least generically mental, and processing itself can be described in terms of language. Therefore, in the ultimate CTMU analysis, the dichotomy between universalism and strong linguistic determinism dissolves into equivalence at the highest level. The structure of mind and the structure of language are the same structure, and so it doesn't really make any sense to talk about one determining the other. They're both determined at the same time because they're one unity. But on lower levels, such as that between just natural languages and how that affects various types of thinking, sort of on just lower levels of cognition, there can be an interplay of intermediate degrees of dependence there. And I don't really have much to say about specifics on that, but in principle it's possible. Of course, the language which is coupled to the culture that you grow up in can strongly impact your cognition. And cognition obviously played a role in the development of that culture in general, so there is interplay on those lower levels. Here's a little footnote that I found in the CTMU, a new kind of reality paper. A new kind of reality theory paper, I should say. Which is that note that the mind equals reality principle does not assert, e.g., that the fruits of human imagination are real, except as neural firing patterns with no necessary relevance to anything outside the brain, or that we can immediately make things real just by thinking of them. The mind equals reality principle merely says that where mind is the engine of cognition and perception, and these processes are jointly regarded as language, obeying rules of syntax, this syntax, the rules of cognition and perception, necessarily distribute over percipient and percept. So here we get the mind equals reality principle and the linguistic principle of linguistic reducibility. It's kind of one thing here. Note that while this account of natural language refers to the representation of concepts, nowhere does it refer to the objective content, meaning, or interpretation of its expressions. Yet even though one of the primary functions of language is to represent objective facts about the real world, facts which naturally reflect its structure, the natural language concept is defined in complete abstraction from the external universe, which is commonly treated as though it were completely independent of language and cognition. This putative mutual independence of language and universe, the way L equals sigma, gamma, and S of sigma omits the symbol U for universe, thus isolating L from its domain of discourse, amounts to a pernicious form of dualism, which abstractly, artificially, and wrongly separates the elements of an inseparable pair. And yes, Chris is fully justified to continue hammering this point home. This is a very inculcated form of duality in our modern way of thinking, and it is not valid. Definitely isn't valid. If we are a part of one reality, we're trying to study a single reality, we're not going to get anywhere fruitful by breaking it down into two or more totally inseparable components. So moving on, in short, the capacity of language to accurately represent the external universe is far too reliable and extensive for this unequivocal kind of dualism to hold. It is not that we are always successful in predicting factual observations from language alone. Rather, it is the very possibility of bringing language into conformance with reality and vice versa that dualism cannot explain. If dualism were justified, and language and reality were truly separate and independent, then there would be no basis for bringing them together, and neither science nor any form of human experience would be possible. The above definition, L equals sigma, gamma, and S of sigma, is therefore misleading in the way that its parentheses, like impermeable walls, isolate human cognitive language from the universe it so effectively, but improbably represents. Right, if there wasn't a relationship between language and cognition, or mind and body, in the Cartesian dualistic terms, which is what dualism says, is that there's no relationship other than a paradoxical relationship of there not being a relationship, then it just directly contradicts our experience, which is that we can explain perceptual reality, or the physical universe of our perceptions, with our mental constructs or our scientific theories, mathematical theories. We can do engineering, build technology, all of that. And it's not just, and even more funnily than that, even more fundamentally than that, we experience the world of perception along with our minds. And so what is that coupling? That's what Descartes does not explain when he says that we have our mind and body and they're separate. Why, if they're separate, then why are they always together? That seems totally paradoxical. And it is. So some readers will recognize that this is simply a formal generalization of the oft-cited unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences to non-mathematical languages and reality at large. Yes, exactly. How can we even talk about reality with English if language and reality were not coupled in a fundamental way? It is also a statement to the effect that any language which truly supports the identification of its universe must everywhere couple to that universe through classical two-valued logic, which provides the true false or 1-0 distinction in terms of which the universe and its contents may be distinguished. This coupling is an untapped well that goes very deep indeed. In order to identify anything, you need to distinguish it from its complement. This is totally general. Even even in non-classical logics like paraconsistent logics, paracomplete logics, you still have the laws or axioms of those logics themselves, which need to be distinguished from their complement. So even if you're in a logic that can allow for a third possibility, or any other variant or relaxation of the axioms of classical logic, still basic two-valued classical logic needs to exist on the level of the logics themselves in order to even distinguish them from their complements. You can't exercise an axiom and the negation of that axiom at the same time. So, yeah, in order to distinguish anything, it has to have a boundary, like any object in your environment. You see the object and then you see the space around the object. And if that weren't the case, then it would be indistinguishable from the medium itself. In which case you couldn't distinguish it from itself. There's only one. It's kind of like the idea that there's only one empty set, and there's only one, set of all sets, or universal set, or whatever. Alright, so that brings us to the end of the section. I think we've gone into a satisfactory amount of detail here. Sorry if I wasn't the most articulate at times. I feel like I'm getting better and more comfortable, and I appreciate y'all bearing with me in that process, and hopefully even enjoying the process with me, and I look forward to continuing it in the next video, with the next section discussing level 2, formal languages. Alright, y'all have a blessed day. Bye.